And today I'm very pleased to welcome special guests, our former colleague, Professor Karol Olejniczak from SWPS University, currently with his PhD student or supervised researcher, Aidan Hudson-Lapore. Welcome very warmly. And we are going to listen about the innovative potential of urban policy labs, as I understand about your research. Welcome. You have 45 minutes to present your study, and then we will open the floor for questions from the public here and people who are observing us online. Perfect.
Thank you for the invitation. It's truly a pleasure to be with you and to share our research insights with you on this seminar that has such a long and dynamic tradition of intellectual exchange. And personally, for me, on a personal note, it's not long ago I was a student of EuroRec, and later on I had the pleasure to be as Agnieszka said, a staff of EuroRec. So today is kind of a homecoming. I'm really happy that that I can bring the new generation of researcher to share with you the thoughts with the new generation of students and hopefully future researcher and policy practitioners. So we wish you the best, and we hope that we will inspire you today with these things. So we are bringing to you the topic of urban policy labs, and we thought this would be interesting topic for you because of two things. First of all, it is a promising phenomenon, organizational phenomenon of bringing together researchers with policy practitioners around very specific policy topics. So we will see that there are very tangible things that are trying to solve on those policy areas. So we thought that it could be interesting because there is an opportunity for you as the researcher in university to engage in this type of activities. The second point of interest potential is that this could extend your spectrum of research methods, because those labs are bringing a lot of stuff from the design disciplines, which is originally designing the tangible things and tangible objects, especially those methods on quickly testing things and co-creating things collectively with stakeholders or with users. So maybe that would be interesting as well to extend in the spectrum of your social science research methods. So how we will go through the story, as you see the three bubbles, and we will be just unpacking those bubbles, zooming in onto the details. The first bubble is about the overview of urban policy labs around the world. It's just some basic stats, who they are and what they do. And this is based on my Polish National Science Foundation grant. It's like tiny part of this grant. Together with Adam Wellstad and Irina Krawczuk, they had the grant from American National Science Foundation. So they're just running this big overview of all policy labs around the world. And part of the database was on urban policy labs. So you see the part of this. So once we see the overview, who they are, what they do, then Aidan will dive deep into the methods, and she will focus on these methods coming from design. And you will see a lot of examples how this happens in different cities. And once we deal with this, we will move to, and this part is based on Aidan's ongoing research, PhD research, which is also part of the bigger project that she will talk about. And then the last bubble is about lessons learned, mainly our reflections from the journey that we have with city of Warsaw when we were running for the last few years Warsaw Food Lab. And you will see just main conclusions of what we think, what can be improved, and how we can move forward. And we will close with some points for potential future research and practice-oriented activities. So that's the big picture. So let's dive into the first bar. The policy lab it's an organizational phenomenon in public policy that is maybe like 10 years old. They started to bubble up around the world, those policy labs. It sounds like a fashionable, cool thing to say that we are working in a policy lab on making our policies better. These are basically collaborative platforms when you bring different stakeholders and the government together with researchers try to quickly come up with the new creative ideas of solving the problem or addressing the policy problem, and then trying to test it, like pilot testing this. And you have the labs that are specialized in particular method, like using mainly digital analysis and resources, or using behavioral science and psychology. There are labs who specialized on a particular level of decision making and the level of our reality, which could be EU big lab that's looking at the multi-annual programs and policies. And there are lots of urban labs who are working with daily things that are happening on the streets of our cities. So that's another way of looking at those policy labs. And of course, you have the labs that are more practice-oriented and more theory-oriented, etc., etc. All of them are doing co-design, and what the co-design means and how it looks like, Aidan will tell you later on, but it's basically coming up quickly with the very creative ideas and trying to test it in reality. We focus on urban policy labs, and we define them within this policy lab bigger population by three things. They have to deal with urban issues grounded in a very specific local context, like Warsaw, New Delhi, New York, Washington, DC. They have to run projects or activities for the city or with the city that goes beyond just events or conferences. A lot of these labs if you look in the internet, they are just a platform for organizing events for the city. That's not what we were looking for, right? And then the third condition is that they are not purely commercial organizations. You will find when you start Googling urban policy lab, there will be lots of private architecture companies who call themselves labs because that sounds exciting and you are doing something experimenting. It sells better. So we are not interested in those either. Our study identified 79 urban policy labs back in 2023. Some of them didn't survive, but that's for later. If you would be interested how we did it step by step, it was a tedious process, but we can feed your curiosity later on in the discussion, and I can provide the paper details how we did it. I will skip that, but just let's say that this is the population of 79, and let's see what they are and how they are doing the things. So in terms of geographical spread, it's mainly Europe and North America. It could be the issue of how we search the labs. We were looking back then into English-speaking web pages. So if the lab has the English web page, then we were following this and putting in our database. That was before the amazing era of AI could translate the web pages in a blink of an eye. So now we would probably go after the Korean, so South Korean, not North Korean, but South Korean labs. They have them, but only in the Korean language. Maybe we'll have our database. Top cities that out of the top global metropolis, only Beijing and New Delhi have their labs. And there are multiple labs in certain cities like New York, Atlanta, French, Nantes. In terms of how they are organized, you see that most of them are organizations. So somehow the city or the university come up with some organizational form to have it. But a lot of them are also long-term projects, which means that basically if the project is finished, like the multi-annual Horizon project, then it's possible that the lab would be closed. Or they will be going and looking for another funding, other project, but it's the sustainable effort. The interesting part is about the affiliation. A lot of them are connected with the university, which means the university is the leader, the lab. It's the spiritus movement, the engine of this. There are some local authorities initiatives, and you see the business and other. We have in 20 cases, we have a problem even to establish who is actually on the drive seat of the lab. So sometimes we just didn't know who is the leader. And what they do. So the main message here is that policy labs rarely do policy. They mainly do projects, little things, or services. So policy is understood as the multi-annual idea of how we have more citizens in Poland because there is the number of Polish people are decreasing. That's the multi-annual policy. Rarely it's touched by labs. They're rather focusing on smaller things. So that's the main message. I was also interested in terms of when they start doing things with the public sector, in terms of what type of decision situations they help with. So in terms of agenda setting, not so much. Agenda setting is understood like lab is coming and telling you, listen guys, there will be a problem in a few years with AI destroying the teaching methods at the university. How about we start thinking about this now and do something within our lab? So they rarely put these things, new ideas on the agenda. They are rather focused on designing things or redesigning things that are already there, or testing and evaluating policies or programs that are already there. So it's not like super creative things that they are trying to do. They're also trying to do the rethinking the problems. If you, again, think about the problem of of Poland population, you can approach it as the economical problem or social security problem or maybe psychological problem. Each of those reconfiguration will require different policy tools. You will invest in 800 plus and make it 7,000 plus if you believe that this is only about the economy, or if you believe in more social security, you will work on regulations on the labor market to make the things secure for the parents leaving a job for a while and raising a kid. So you see, there is reframing of policy problem is it's really important thing. They don't do that that often. So that is what they do and who they are. And now let's unpack the next bubble of UPLs.
Wonderful. Thank you. So to intro my part of this research, or what I looked into detail, was what methods from product design, service design, more kind of commercial design methods ended up getting applied in Policy Lab's approach to their projects. For a little bit of context here, these design-led approaches have been coming into kind of public sector work for around 10 years or so. And policy labs are generally understood as one of the main types of organizations that drive the use of design methods within the public sector to solve or help address, shall we say, public sector problems. These sorts of methods are often not unique to design. Things like user research or interviews or observations with members of the public, kind of convening or collaborative sessions with different stakeholders across government to think about problem framing or developing solution ideas to a particular issue, or means of visualizing data to make it more accessible to decision makers or members of the public, right? We see there's a constellation of methods that we might expect to be present in design-led labs or design teams, but we would also expect to be seen in teams like behavioral insight teams or kind of more traditional urban design or urban planning labs. But generally, policy labs, these kind of design-led or experimental approaches, this kind of focus on users and multiple people within a policy problem or who are affected by a policy problem, are seen as a distinguishing feature of these policy labs. So the research question that we conducted here in this survey of labs, or this database of labs, was just trying to look at what are the design methods that these labs are actually using in their projects, right? Because you'll see a lot of these labs might characterize themselves as, hey, we're an evidence-based policy lab, we're an urban planning lab, we're a human-centered design lab. But naming this kind of high-level approach, we figured may or may not correspond with the methods they were using in their day-to-day projects. So our particular interest here was seeing what of these design methods, like prototyping or in-person observations, have made it from kind of this scholarly recommendation of this might be helpful to actual on-the-ground applied projects. And do we see that those methods are being applied consistently across different disciplines or across different types of labs? So that was the overall motivation study. And the other thing that made policy labs interesting as kind of an organizational structure to look at, right, is they often will talk about themselves as interdisciplinary. We work with a range of experts across like political science, economy, urban design, like communications, but they tend to have kind of fealty or grounding in one particular tradition of policymaking, like participatory democracy or behavioral insights or open data. But in theory, at least, policy labs might capture this range of disciplinary orientations. So it would be you would expect that looking at policy labs data, policy labs methods would help us understand kind of in practice what are the design methods that have demonstrated their value or at least piqued some interest across these different disciplinary orientations. And then, drum rolls. What did we see as the most common methods across these different disciplines? Pretty much what we would expect actually from our expectations on what makes design methods useful. They're useful for helping scope problems and communicate different observations of data to a wide range of audiences. So we saw that a lot of these labs use mapping or visualization in their work. Obviously, interviews and surveys with members of the to understand what some of the current problems people are facing are in a particular context. We saw a really high use of collaborative workshops, either with members like the public or different policymakers, to try and convene people around coming up with solution ideas or defining a problem. And then, of course, we saw a lot of prototyping experiments, the sort of small-scale testing that Karol mentioned, to get feedback on policy ideas as implemented before scaling up. So very much living up to their title of being a lab and testing. Want to note that these kind of methods were used across labs that had a very wide range of methods or disciplinary orientations, including labs that specifically on their websites or in their project pages named themselves as using design methods or being a design-led lab, but also in labs projects that didn't necessarily specifically name design as one of their influences would still use some of these methods, even if they identified as a living lab or a lab that focused on urban planning or smart cities, for example. That's the overview. At this point, we'd love to take some time just to share some examples of what these look like in practice at the different labs. So starting with prototyping pilots and experiments, we saw a couple different ways that labs kind of tested their policy ideas or used prototyping in their projects. As one example, some labs like the Dublin beta projects really focused on using these small scale kind of prototypes or initial like minimum viable product or least expensive way of testing a policy idea that responded to a resident's problem in Dublin, but the prototype was really meant to help make a decision of we proceed with this policy or we do not proceed with this policy idea. I think that sets it apart from oftentimes pilots or other forms of experimentation that are focused on improving what was existing. The explicit goal of these projects was to say, for example, we think that cargo bikes might be interesting to add to the city's bike share program. What's the easiest or quickest way to see if people use it? By deploying literally one cargo bike in one neighborhood and observing whether it gets used, for what types of trips, and then interviewing the people who used it or not in that neighborhood to then make a decision about, do we think cargo bikes are useful for expanding to a bike share network? We also saw prototyping used with some labs more as a way of gathering feedback on in-process or existing projects. So the lab at DC used prototyping to convene residents in an effort to improve the city's forms. So instead of, let's say, the design team at lab at DC saying, hey, we have these new form ideas, let's get feedback on them, they gathered residents into a room with public servants to help public servants understand, hey, these are the issues that residents are running into with different forms, and provide an opportunity for the people who are responsible for designing these forms to really hear what are the places that residents are running into challenges as they try to fill out these forms and kind of work collaboratively on these suggestions. So prototyping in this case was not used for residents to design the final forms, but to understand what are the issues in these correct forms. And then that resulted in more formal updates to things like applying for a food truck permit that then got updated throughout the city. Then the final version of kind of prototyping or piloting or experimentation we saw, an approach we saw, was labs that basically said, here's a physical area in the city. Here's one block or a couple blocks where we work with, hey, are you a smart sensor company? Are you interested in piloting autonomous vehicles? Do you want to see about charging electric bikes? This is the neighborhood you get to do that. Nowhere else. Here, where labs really acted not as the collaborator or innovator necessarily, but saying, here's how we set the terms of this prototype or innovation. And in exchange for being able to test your new service or program, give us the data, help us understand how we can work with you, this external business or university, to apply this result in the future. That was prototyping. Another very common method we saw was this and map. I'd say that this was more common with the academic or university affiliated labs. Many times these kind of data visualizations or maps were the final product of the collaboration with the city. So helping answer a city question or responding to a policy problem. For example, the Bay Area Urban Lab did a crowdsourced platform with tenants to help address information asymmetries in the housing market. This was interesting because it responded to a civic problem of, hey, rental conditions are not very transparent. What can we do as a lab? We can make that information more available to other tenants. And through this data visualization or mapping, help empower advocacy organizations within the city to address this problem outside of formal public sector remit. This lab also provided some more traditional kind of database consolidation and making data easier to use for the city, like through a built environment database. And then similarly, the MIT Sensible City Lab is interesting. They primarily worked on piloting methods for research in the cities. So developing new methods like a particular form of sensing or machine learning to look at, how are curbs being used in a city. Their primary output is academic papers, but their approaches were really looking at how do we answer a research question the city has, pilot a method to develop it, and then use data visualization in addition to these academic outputs to help explain what were the results of these projects and how did we approach this method to members of the public or other interested parties. Something else we saw quite commonly with labs, right, was on the street observation in addition to kind of big data or administrative data, which came up pretty commonly. But a lot of these labs, because they are focused on, hey, what's happening in this specific place, really saw the value of going in person to that place, having interviews in context, and being able to supplement that kind of bigger administrative data with more qualitative or human observations. The City Lab of Barcelona did a study in a particular neighborhood in Barcelona, kind of over the years during the pandemic and also in responses to new development in the area to answer questions around how did the pandemic and how did these new developments influence how people are interacting on the street with one another? What appear to be the kinds of social interactions in this neighborhood? And are we seeing those change over time? Which is a type of question, right, that is relatively difficult to answer with more kind of distant or quantitative data. And then finally, perhaps the most common method that we saw labs use was workshops, convening different stakeholders to address a problem. I'd say there were three main categories that we saw. Were labs focusing on bringing together stakeholders for a policy problem like what is the future of electric vehicles in a particular city, bringing people from businesses, end users, members of city government, and academic experts to help the city talk through what are some of these strategic elements, and might there be aspects of this problem that are hard for us as a city to understand from our viewpoint that should be integrated into our strategy. Like, notably, these workshops didn't necessarily correspond with in-person or physical prototyping, but were by many of these labs seen as kind of this isolated strategy development program. The other version of workshops that we saw were really focused on members of the public and using workshops as a way to build awareness of different problems in the city and start trying to connect to community advocates around problems like bicycle theft, right? And being able to get a perspective from members of the public in this particular project on what do we think the role of academia, police, members of the public, bicycle businesses, like what do we think the roles are of the different actors in the city in developing a strategy to address these issues? So again, the outputs of this process were not necessarily, hey, we're going to implement this specific idea in the city, but rather to help members of the city or the lab understand how are residents on the ground understanding the role of these different actors and how might that differ from how the city is understood. And then finally, just to shout out that there were a couple labs that instead of the perhaps traditional meeting, conversation, post-it notes, develop a strategy document, use some more innovative methods for these kind of collaborative discussions. For example, serious games, being able to convene people around a more narrative or experiential process. In this case, looking at what elder care might look in a neighborhood and help gathering citizens' perspectives on what would it mean to have a caring neighborhood, and kind of through the facilitated conversations and people as they play this game, be able to gather some insights that wouldn't necessarily come up from just directly asking someone to describe what does a caring neighborhood look like to you, or what should our priorities around elder care be, allowing things to emerge a little bit more organically. So that's kind of the whirlwind tour of some of the different methods of these labs used in addition to more traditional social science methods. I will hand it over to Karol.
Yes, and we'll unpack the lab bubble. Lessons learned, and these are the, as I mentioned, a journey that we have with the city of Warsaw, and a few words about the content of this project. The focus of this lab was on the food waste problem exclusively. And it was nested in a bigger initiative. City of Warsaw approaches SWPS. Can you help us be an academic part of this project? Because we should have the academic partner, because we are in this amazing Horizon 2020 with Italians, and we are doing something on food, and how we could say no to that opportunity. So that was a bigger food trails project, multi-annual, and different cities and academia trying to figure out different ways of dealing with the food systems. We pick up on food waste product. Other cities focused on different aspects of the food issues. And eventually, over the time, we focused on doing two things. One action was help organizations that are taking the food from the Mazovian food bank and then preparing this for their beneficiaries. So it's like homeless shelters or facilities for older people that were using the resources from the food bank to cook. Their problem was that a lot of things got wasted because they were always confronted with the Polish joke is kuchnia pełna niespodzianek. There was a program years ago. Google it in YouTube. It's a kuchnia pełna niespodzianek, right? And za chwilę dalszy ciąg programu. So anyway, you never know what would be the thing that you are going to cook, because it's a gift and it's coming, and you can get 200 kilos of paprika. And what I usually do is paprika for your older generation beneficiaries. So they were struggling with this, and that whole idea was how to help them focus basically on maximizing the use of donated fruit, veggies, and bread, because these are the most nutritious and most expensive products. So that was the one action. The other action was help small restaurants in sharing prepared food surplus. So when they end up with their working day, they could share what they cooked, and they should do it in a safely way according to the government regulations. They're extremely confusing, and the restaurant owners are basically afraid of doing things. Better to toss it than to do something with this, because you don't want to bad media and Facebook, nor you don't want the problems, actual problems with the people who got bad food from them. So that was two different actions with two different groups of stakeholders. One was really end up with redesigning their space with our industrial designers, so redesigning the kitchen and the storage space, plus redesigning their processes, mise en place, and how to cook and how to use the things when you are not a cook person, because there are lots of voluntaries there, like people just coming in and say, how can I help? And I say, well, you could cook something to our older you, and it's like, I don't know how to cook, but can you help me? So there was some procedures developed so they could work, and we of course tested it with them, with the food bank. And then the second thing was more on just designing with the lawyers leaflet that is in a Polish language that is understandable for the busy professionals, how you can donate the food safely and what you should do according to the Polish regulations. So that was the main work. But that's the bigger consortium that you could see that each city was doing very exciting different things with in their own places. But stepping out and just talking about the lessons learned throughout this journey, not talking about this particular products that we develop for the city and with the city, I have 5 observations. The first one, from our university perspective, we feel that this arrangement with the public officials, it worked. It was a safe space to experiment, come sometimes with the crazy idea, even better, step back and say, this is not a good idea, let's change. So we were changing, I think, our target groups at least 3 times. Initially, it's supposed to be a veggie stance on the markets to sell a good veggies. But then we have a thought like how you can sponsor economically and not disturb the economical local thing, and you sponsor some of the veggie stands, not the others, right? Like, how do we choose that? Then the war started. Russia attacked Ukraine, and there was an influx of immigrants, and there was the food waste issue as well. We wanted to help, but at the same time, that help was not always smart. The city said, okay, we cannot invent the things now on the fly. We understand that it's a different timeline because we are dealing with the fire now, but can we be smarter for the future and come up with the food bank ideas of how to use the food? And that's how we switched to the food bank. And they say that their increase of beneficiaries, it was like almost by 100% that the war with Ukraine. So that was, we were switching even what we are going to do. So that was useful to have this flexibility. Then the second thing was really helpful for us to have this, and you need this theoretical background or like template or a backbone of 3 or 4 questions that guides you through all these crazy ideas that you have, not to go crazy and get lost about your mission. Then ultimately you have to come up with certain product or the outcome. So theory of change framework was really useful for us, basically asking ourselves, who is the target group, what behaviors we want to help with, and what are the blockages, what stops them from behaving in a way that we want to help them. So cooking and using the maximum of donated food, how we can help them and what stops. So that was useful. And in an article, and later on we can send you the details, like 1-pager of this whole project written in as a theory of change. Then the third thing was that learning from others, which is literature review, it took us almost a year to actually become knowledgeable about the food waste strategies. You don't want to rediscover America, as we Polish say, so let's check out what is already been done in food waste and food banks. And it took us a lot of time. And now from the time perspective, I can say that with AI, we could do it probably not in 1 year, but in 2 or 3 months, this super quick quasi-systematic literature review, which would be amazing speed up. And again, also digesting on what we've seen, all these research surveys and the observation on the street, with AI, it would be much easier as I see it now with another projects that we are doing. So that was the most time consuming, reading and getting the manageable conclusions out of the readings. And I think this can be speed up, this part can be speed up with AI. The insights from the field research, and that was the biggest, that was always a fan. Thanks to Professor Gorzelak, I was always a fan of traveling and seeing things, right? We are the people who wants to see in reality. And so empirical studies is great. But I was shocked in this project how different were the survey results when people in the organization are telling us what's bothered and where is the problem, from actually observing them for 2 weeks and seeing where is the problem happen. So as the designers say, fish is not aware that it's wet. So usually you are not aware of the main blockages. And those guys, they're really not aware where the main problems of their food process happening. So observations, ethnographic studies, amazing thing if you do it well for the extended time, so you could really see the observation that are transpired. And the last thing, that's we really enjoy the journey with City of Warsaw, with our colleagues from City of Warsaw, but we concluded that things took twice much time as you initially planned, mainly because of interactivity of the process and so many interactions and so many trying of the piloting. We went with the first design from our School of Design guys, and that was a part of the project to design a certain low energy storing spaces that use the circulation of air and the natural materials. And it just turns out that it doesn't fit their space because they are really crowded. So the whole amazing design has to be totally redesigned. And that was a physical thing that we have to do it again, but also all this psychological things, how people behave in this space and what they do or forget to do. That was really time consuming, and there was a lot of interactions that was useful at the end. A little bit frustrating from the theory building and academic writing perspective, because we want to write some articles and we still are redoing the project, but it was fun and eventually it was useful. So that's it from the lessons from the Warsaw Lab. And here the final battle.
Yep. So summing all of it up, what did we learn from looking at policy labs? What were some of your takeaways from the supply collaboration at the city? One little bit of context, perhaps I should have given up top too, is I worked as a service designer in government and the policy lab before starting my PhD. So I think I'm very interested in how these methods can be applied both in practice and contributing to theory. And I think from this large-scale overview, one of the big takeaways is that there's still a lot of design methods that are waiting in the toolbox, like ready to be used, right? We saw some really encouraging signs of these applied research teams and policy labs, like doing collaborative interviews to understand like what are different perspectives on a problem, using prototyping and pilots, even starting to broach into serious games as ways of collecting more representative or richer insights from residents than might be possible through things like surveys. But there's a much wider range of design methods, right, than pure data visualization or, facilitation of a workshop or even this kind of small scale prototyping, right? There's kind of rich co-design sessions. There's ride-along interviews, like asking people, like accompanying people as they go about their day-to-day to gain these kind of insights of what are some of the challenges they experience in a particular city, right? That we see that there is this very promising kind of inroad of methods in these labs kind of across disciplines, but there's still some opportunity to bring some of the suggested methods from this kind of design for policy world into practice. So I think that's a very exciting area of research. One other thing we saw from these labs, right, is think of themselves and in many respects are interdisciplinary, right? Like bringing together urban design, urban planners, designers, economists, um, into their applied projects. But we often found that these labs used methods or had a project approach that still kind of stayed within one paradigm, right? That there were the behavioral insights labs that, though they used, design methods and RCTs and thinking about social science research and behavioral insights, they wouldn't necessarily use arts-based research to gather more of an emotional perspective of how people experience policies, or might use less of these ethnographic or kind of like emotional scale interviews to understand this experience, because they are much more focused on behavior. At a similar level, labs that had more of a participatory democracy kind of affiliation, like really focused on expanding or deepening participation, might not use as much administrative data or other sorts of mapping or questions of, measurably what is happening to inform or contextualize some of their deeper, more qualitative findings. So we think there's some opportunities here to even broaden out what are the mixed methods being used to triangulate results and make decisions to help define problems and help develop solutions. Um, Similarly, and I think this will be a surprise to probably no one in the audience, that bridging the design and implementation, like actually bringing good ideas into practice, always an important area of investigation. Lots of these labs, right, like the city of Dublin, for example, coming up with these very small scale prototypes that say, hey, maybe people loved this cargo bike. We know that we want to scale it up, but then there's still this question of, okay, how do you actually feed that into the contractor? And that is working with the city to deliver, the city bikes program. We have to redo the parking spaces. How do we actually translate those findings into practice? I think is something that's very much appreciated both from a scholarly and a practice perspective. Um, I think as you noted as well, Karol, right? A lot of these labs are focused on service delivery, particular resident experience with forms, for example, which are extremely important and worth investigating, worth working on. But this question of this more upstream policy, like how do we develop strategy and thinking about, the rollout of AI in education, or how do we respond to more extreme weather, like things with these 5-year more abstract timelines? There is potential for things like serious games and interviews and these collaborative sessions to help shape those discussions. But generally, where we see a lot of the work right now is in this concrete service delivery. So I think plenty of more room to look at the longer term policy side of things. Um,
The last I added this one last night. That's on an optimistic basis. We think that it's a promising, space and approach to bring together researchers. We're excited about making a impact, that we call it at the university third mission. This is our third mission, to really have the impact on the reality and support the decision makers with the evidence, with the insights from the research. But it is, of course, challenging because it's time consuming. It requires a lot of investment in terms of time, less resources, but in terms of time and the dynamics and overcoming the institutional challenges on both sides of the barricade. Well, I guess that both sides of the science and the public policy. So yeah, we would encourage you to try in the small scale. The fun thing is that you can really try in a small scale. It doesn't have to be the policy with the central government. As we show, it's more about service and the smaller projects that really matters and that are tangible, and you can see the results of this in your neighborhood space. Thank you.